Tonight we're going to talk about Jewish history. The Torah actually says that there is an important idea to talk about Jewish history. That remember the days of history, understand the years of each generation. There is some benefit to learning history. So I was thinking, what are the benefits of learning Jewish history specifically? So I think there are four main benefits. The first one is that as Jews, a lot of people have learned parts of Jewish history before. We know things about Jewish history. We just might not know where all the pieces fit in relative to the other pieces. Yeah? So the first benefit, I think, of learning Jewish history is to understand how all the pieces fit together. The second important idea is that Jewish history is really our family history. You know, history didn't start the day I was born. Right? My history begins many, many, many moons before I came along. That's also a part of my history. Really?
Yeah, I like taking photos of things.
Okay. You know, we're all direct descendants, either biological or spiritual, of the first Jew of Abraham. Right? There are about 152 generations from Abraham to us, and that's Jewish history. Right? It's not as much as you think it is. The third reason I would say it's important to learn Jewish history is because Jewish history is really world history. Yeah? If you learn French history, for example, you learn the history of the country of France and all that happened there. When you learn Jewish history, you really learn world history because Jews have been everywhere. And we've been a player in all of the main civilizations throughout world history. And we'll see that tonight. Jewish history is really the study of Jewish values disseminating throughout the world. Right? It's not a coincidence that as Judaism spread to other countries, so did Jewish ideas and Jewish values. Okay? So we'll see that also tonight. And finally, I think that there's a very important idea to learn from Jewish history because there are things about Jewish history that are unique to Jewish history. Yeah? Now, let me explain that. One of the challenges with learning history is that people get caught in the nuts and bolts. Right? They lose the forest from the trees. When you learn all of Jewish history in one go, so what it allows you to do is to take a step back and look at the overriding trends as well as the discrete specific events. There is an arc to Jewish history. Okay? Jewish history is not just a series of random events. Jewish history is an arc throughout time. We'll see that as well tonight. It goes like this. We've mentioned this many times before. There is a purpose to the world. God created the world for a purpose, and there is a purpose to the Jewish people. The Jewish people have a mission in this world. And Jewish history and Jewish future is really the study and the application of the Jewish mission in the world. Okay? So God promises to Abraham, right back at the beginning, that the Jewish people will complete their mission. The world will fulfill its purpose. So if you wanted to kind of put that on a graph, Jewish history would look like this. Right? As time goes on, we achieve more of mankind's mission until we reach some ultimate point where the purpose of the world has been completed. That is really Jewish history in a nutshell right there. Okay? Now I say in theory, because the real world is messier. For example, in the real world, things don't move in straight lines. Right? It would really look something like that. You know, you have good days and bad days, but over time, the general trend is up and to the right. Okay, that's probably a more realistic idea of what world history would look like. Now, in reality, here's what I think it looks like. I think this is a pretty accurate depiction of Jewish history. If you only gave me 3 lines and said, draw Jewish history, that's what I think it looks like. Now, again, in reality, it's more like that. Right? Good days and bad days. But I think that is a pretty good approximation of the arc of Jewish history. Okay? Tonight, I would like to get through 2/3 of this. Here's the timeline we're going to use. We're going to start about 1200 BCE, and we're going to get through to about, call it 1800 Common Era here. Okay, so we'll call that 3,000 years of elapsed time. So that's our kind of time frame. Okay, now these are the arc that we saw before. Okay, this is the remember this. Okay, this that's that.
Oh, good.
Okay.
That is great.
Told you.
So basically, as I see, from 1200 BCE up to 0, we were on the way up. Since then, the last 2,000 years of gullus of exile, we've been going all the way down.
So living in Israel as opposed to living in exile, meaning the living in exile section is not living in Israel. We're living outside of Israel?
Yes.
Yes.
Literally not living in the land of Israel.
Okay. So it could be Lebanon, it could be Europe.
It could be.
Okay.
All the other places
We
we've
just,
just left past
whatever
the
existed
years.
then, yeah, we're just
Yeah.
not in Israel.
Okay, so here are the major epochs I want to look at. Okay, this is how I'm going to break it down. And again, it's kind of made up. Okay, but this is the way I think about the major tekufas, the major periods, major epochs in Jewish history. Okay, so if we put that all together, this is the plan for tonight. Okay. All right, hopefully that's all self-explanatory. I really tried to simplify it as much as possible, but there's a lot of information here. One small caveat for people who care about details, some of the dates I'm going to mention are up for discussion. Very often you find dates in historical events can be off by a year or two. Okay, don't get hung up on the exact number. Right? If I say the second temple was destroyed in 70 CE, and you say no, it wasn't, it was 68, I don't want to argue about that. Okay, just don't worry about the accountants in the room. Okay, here we go. We're going to start essentially with the period of the judges. Okay, the period of the judges essentially begins after the Jews enter the land of Israel. Okay, so Rabbi Safar taught about crash course in Torah a couple of weeks ago. He talked about before being in Egypt, the time in Egypt, leaving Egypt, 40 years in the desert. Essentially, the 5 books of Moses finish right when the Jews are on the cusp of going to the land of Israel. Okay, Joshua takes the Jews into the land of Israel in approximately 1272 BCE. Okay, that's really where our story picks up now. Okay. When the Jews first came into the land of Israel, it took 14 years to conquer the land and then to settle it. They divided it amongst the 12 tribes that were there, and they settled it. Now, they didn't have a formal leadership structure. The reason why this is called the period of the judges and not the period of the kings is because there were no kings when they first came into the land. Okay? The idea was that everybody kind of did their own thing, and when there was some sort of a national crisis that required centralized leadership, so a great person in that generation, a judge, stepped up and temporarily became the leader of their generation, dealt with the problem, then everybody went back to doing their own thing.
And people trusted that person.
Yes. Yes, that person was usually a prophet, a person of tremendous spiritual stature. But again, it was a leadership as necessary, not leadership for the sake of leadership. Right? So some of the judges were in their position of authority for a few years, some for 20, 30, 40 years, depending on what was going on.
They weren't appointed.
They were not formally appointed, no.
Yeah.
Exactly. Probably 2 of the famous judges you may have heard of, Devorah was one of the judges. Devorah is very significant because she was...
They look like Lego, yeah.
Lego's been around for a long time.
Interesting.
Devorah was significant because she was actually the longest reigning judge during the period of time. She reigned for 40 years. She was a woman who was a leader of the Jewish people. So understand this is, 3,000 years before women get the vote in the rest of most of the world, much less have the opportunity to become leaders. Yeah, the Jewish people had a female leader 3,000 years ago. That's actually pretty cool. Another judge you may have heard of, Samson, Shimshon, he of the strength fame. Yeah, he was also one of the judges during that period of time. The enemy number one of the Jewish people was the Plishtim, the Philistines. Nothing to do with the Palestinians. Completely different people. The Plishtim were a seafaring nation in the Mediterranean, and they were kind of the enemy of the day. So Samson was fighting against the Plishtim.
They were pirates, weren't they?
Kind of.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Because that's how they make money. By looting.
I don't know if that was the only way they made money, but that was one of the
Oh,
ways they
sorry,
made money.
yeah.
I thought they were
well,
accountants.
not the only way, but looting was their expertise.
Okay, the last of the judges, and the transition to the king's period was a man by the name of Samuel, Shmuel. Okay, Shmuel is one of the judges, but he was also a prophet. And at some point, God says to him, "We're now going to transition from the period of the judges into the period of the kings." And again, whereas the judges were kind of ad hoc leaders, the period of kings is a time of actual formal leadership class. Okay, so that's the end of the period of judges. We move on to the period of the kings. Okay, the first of the kings is King Saul. He's anointed by Shaul on behalf of God. Saul, his kingdom lasted for 2 years. He made a number of mistakes, and as a result, he lost the kingship. Okay, he was replaced by King David. Yeah, David HaMelech. David was really the paradigm for all good kings from here on out. In fact, in Plato's Republic, when he talks about the ideal kings, he talks about the idea of a warrior poet, and he has King David in mind. King David was both a Talmud Chacham, he was both a Torah scholar, he was also a tremendous leader, he was also a warrior, and he was also a poet.
It's like the perfect man.
He was like the perfect man.
I know, girls. I'm looking at you as well.
The original Renaissance
So we all
man.
looked at each other.
The original
It's
Renaissance
nice having
man.
looked at Andrew too. That's nice.
Just
Yeah.
like to know the-
The original
That's
Renaissance
nice.
man, 2,500 years before the Renaissance.
Wow.
Yes.
And he was Jewish. It's like
There was no.
And he was
There was no golf.
And do you know what, actually? If you
What
want
clothes?
to he was
Golf.
No, correct.
tall and dark.
And dark.
Right. Well,
Yeah, well,
And he had a white stallion.
okay,
Sure.
yeah,
He was
well,
short and red-headed.
okay, dig him up and see what he looks like now,
Yeah, that
okay?
was-
Alright? Okay?
Okay, he can be short and red-headed. We don't care, do we?
Let's see what he's got to offer now.
Really, I mean, let's
Dig
not
him
get
up.
hung up.
Okay, so David
Doesn't matter.
David kills the giant Goliath. He becomes the king. His reign lasts for 40 years.
So 14 or 40?
40.
Is that another significant 40 in our history?
If you want it to be, sure.
Yeah. Okay, sure, let's go with that.
Yeah.
Go with that. Yeah.
Okay, King David wants to build the temple in Jerusalem. God says, unfortunately, you are a warrior, you have blood on your hands, and therefore you're not the right person to build it. He was on the right level, but because of what he had done, which was the right thing to do, he wasn't the right person to build the temple. Okay, King David's son, Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, builds the temple. Yeah. Builds the temple. So the first temple is built in about 825 BCE.
Not
Let's
Lego
say.
anymore.
What?
It's not Lego anymore.
It's true. That's a good observation.
Things changed.
Get with the times. Okay, the temple is a very important structure in Judaism because it's really the focal point for the nation. The temple is in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the center, the spiritual center of the Jewish people. 3 times a year there's an obligation, a mitzvah for all the Jewish people to come to the temple. Yeah, the temple is really the focus of the Jewish people. The Jewish High Court, the Sanhedrin, sits right next to the temple. So at this point in Jewish history, this is really the highlight. This is as good as it gets. This is the first Jewish Commonwealth, they call it. We have a king, we have a temple, we have a priest class, the Kohanim, we have a Jewish army. We are essentially have complete political control of the land of Israel and military control to the point where we are pushing up against the neighbors.
What does the map approximately look like compared to today?
So it essentially, if you cut the map off at about Beersheba, everything from Beersheba up to the Galil is Israel proper. Gaza Strip is still being controlled mostly by the Plishtim. And then we'll be pushing into the Jordan is still the East Bank, or West Bank as they call it now. So except for the, we don't go as far as Eilat, but from about Beersheba up into the Negev and north is, we'd recognize as one of Israel. Parts of Syria as well, but approximately what it is now. Okay, King Solomon has a son named Rehoboam. Rehoboam is not a great king, and in fact, he is such not a great king that during his lifetime, God says, Rehoboam, you don't deserve to be the king of the entire Jewish nation anymore. And God splits the Jewish nation into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is called the kingdom of Israel. The southern kingdom is called the kingdom of Judah. Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom. Okay? So I sort of small, we can sort of see it on the map there. The king of the southern kingdom is Rehoboam, who's Shlomo Melech's son, David Melech's grandson. The king of the northern kingdom is a man by the name of Yerovam ben Nevat. Yerovam ben Nevat started off as a holy person and went way off the derech. I was going to say off the
Reservation?
reservation. Thank you. Yes, to the point where he didn't like the fact that 3 times a year the Jews from the northern kingdom were going to Jerusalem to the temple in the southern kingdom. So he sealed up the border so that people couldn't travel. People said, but we have to go to the temple. So he said, not a problem. I will build golden calves for you in the northern kingdom in order that you don't have to go to Jerusalem. This was way off the scheduled program. Okay.
So practically like an ancient King Jong-un.
Okay. Kingdom.
Well,
So that's
because
the North Korea
he
one.
builds,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I hear that. Yes.
But because like, he built a fortress, didn't he?
Right, stop people from leaving.
Yeah.
Oh, I understand.
Okay. Moving forwards in time, the Northern Kingdom, let's focus on that for a minute. The Northern Kingdom essentially has a series of bad kings after worse kings after even worse kings. Things get really, really bad there. And in fact, the Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom are fighting with each other. Jew versus Jew. But Jews are smart, so what do? You go and try to get the neighbors on your side as well. Right? So the Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom were both making deals with the neighbors around Israel to fight on their side. Not a great idea. In about 559 BCE, the Southern Kingdom makes a deal with the king of Assyria. Syria is one of the neighbors to the west of Israel, so let's call it modern day
To the
Iraq.
east?
Sorry, to the east. Yes, to the east. Call it modern day Iraq. The Assyrians come in and essentially conquer the entire northern kingdom. Okay, this is what we call the exile of the 10 tribes, because the northern kingdom consisted of 10 tribes. And the southern kingdom consisted of only the tribes of Yehuda, of Judah, and Benjamin, and the Levium as well, because they were mostly working in the base of Mikdash in the temple as Kohanim Levim. But the other 10 tribes who lived in the northern kingdom are essentially conquered and defeated by the Assyrians and exiled into Assyria. The way it would work is that when the Assyrians conquered someone, they wouldn't leave them in their country. They would remove the population and bring another population in. It was a way of destroying nationalism. They would take you away from your land. They would separate you, split you up, send you all corners of the Assyrian Empire. That's why when we talk about the lost 10 tribes, they weren't just translated somewhere else, they were split up and disseminated throughout the Assyrian Empire. We don't know where those people are anymore. But the Southern Kingdom lasts for 133 years extra before it too is conquered by, at this stage, now the Babylonians. The Babylonians conquered the Assyrian Empire, and they are now the major world power to the east of Israel. The Southern Kingdom, the Kingdom of Judah, had more successful kings. They had like a good one, then a bad one, then a good one, then a bad one. But eventually there's a series of bad kings. God says that's enough. And the Southern Kingdom is also conquered. The temple is destroyed. This is the destruction of the first temple, 422 BCE. Okay, the first temple lasts for 410 years. Yeah, 410. Okay, so what happens to the Jewish people when they are conquered? Okay, so essentially when the Babylonians conquered the Jewish people, they left some people living in Israel. They weren't like the Assyrians. They left some people living in Israel, and they took some people with them back to Babylon. Okay? So if we zoom out, that's the end of the temple, the period of the kings in the first temple. Let's now look at the period of exile. It's a 70-year period between the destruction of the first temple and the rebuilding of the second temple. Okay? Now we're in two places at once. Some of the Jews are still living in Israel. Most of the Jews are living in Babylon, where they have been exiled. But again, the difference is that they were exiled as a group of people, so we essentially stayed together. The most notable event during the period of the Babylonian exile is the story of Purim. Okay? Partway through the exile, the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. Okay? The king of the Persians at this point is Ahasuerus. He has an advisor, Haman. Yeah, and that's essentially the story of Purim takes effect. Okay, zooming out. In the aftermath of the Purim story, Esther's son, who was also Ahasuerus' son, goes on to be a king. His name is Darius. Darius essentially allows the Jews back to Israel to start rebuilding the temple, building what we call the second temple. Let's zoom in on that. Okay, so the second temple is built in 352 BCE. Okay, so we had the first temple, 70-year break. We now have the second temple, 352. Now, not all of the people in Babylon came back to Israel when they were allowed to. Some of them did, those who did rebuild the temple, but not all of them did. Some of them stayed in Babylon. Now, the second temple period is not the same as the first temple. Okay? It's in the same place. They're both in Jerusalem. They're both tremendously holy. But the second temple is not on the same level as the first temple was. There were differences there. And one of the differences was that about 20 years into the second temple period, prophecy ends. Okay? You no longer have prophets. We're no longer on a spiritually high enough level, and so we no longer have prophecy. Now, the ruling body at the time was a group of people. The Jewish High Court was called the Men of the Great Assembly. Okay? The Men of Great Assembly, which were already from the beginning of the Second Temple period, they see that the end of prophecy is coming. And they realize they have to put certain things in place in order to compensate for the fact that the end of prophecy is coming. The most important things from our point of view, the first thing they do is, the first thing they do is, did I do the wrong order? No, okay. The first thing they, sorry, I took a picture out. The first thing they do is they formalize prayer. Okay, so what we think of as standardized prayer, a textbook, a siddur, that was formalized by the Men of the Great Assembly. Okay, up until that point, people had prayed in their own words with their own ideas. The Men of the Great Assembly realized that as Jewish history goes on, that's going to get harder and harder for people to do. So they standardize the text for the Jewish people. The other thing they do is they canonize the Tanakh. They canonize the Bible. This is the point at which what we call Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, is closed. And they choose exactly which books are the prophets, which books are the writings they're going to have included. Okay? So when we talk about the 24 books of the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, right, those 24 were canonized by the Men of the Great Assembly. Okay? So anything that happens after this point is not going to be in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible, because it had already been canonized at this point. Okay. Here's the other main difference between the Second Temple period and the First Temple period. During the First Temple period, the Jewish people had political control of the land of Israel. They were Jewish kings the whole way through. Some of them weren't very nice Jewish kings. They weren't great people, but they were Jewish kings nonetheless. Once we get about halfway through the Second Temple period, right? Originally, you have the Babylonians were in charge, and they were kind of pretty hands-off. The Babylonians are conquered by the Greeks. Okay? Alexander the Great conquers most of the known world, and that includes what we would call the land of Israel. So the Greeks are not hands-off rulers. Okay? The Greeks not only want to have political control of the land of Israel, they also want to impose their culture on the Jewish people. Okay? This is really the Hanukkah story. Yeah? The Greeks try to impose Hellenism on the Jewish people. Some Jews go for it, most don't. That turns into rebellion. And the Jews are in fact able to kick the Greeks out for a certain period of time. Okay? The Hashmonaim, who are the Judah Maccabee, the winners in the Hanukkah story, they become the de facto leaders. Now, it's a little bit problematic because they were Kohanim, they were priests, and really they were not kings. They were not from the family, not from the line of King David, who the kings should come from. It's a little bit problematic that they put themselves in the position of leadership. But for just over 100 years or so, the Maccabees are the leaders of Israel. Now, the thing is, why? Because it always ends up like this. At one point, the Hashmonai king, it's actually a woman, Queen Shalomis Alexandra, has 2 sons. And there is a power struggle as to who is going to be the next king. Yeah? So it happens to be that this is towards the end of the Greek period of control, and the Romans are just starting to have influence in the area. Okay? So these 2 Hashmonaim who are fighting with each other, one of them says, I'm going to go ask the Romans to settle this dispute, which is never a good idea. The Romans come in and they effectively take over the land of Israel. Okay? They say, wonderful, thank you for inviting us in, and they essentially take over. Okay, so again, we still have a functioning temple at this point. The Jews are still living in the land of Israel, but we don't have political autonomy, right? Israel is being run as a vassal state of first Greece and now Rome, which means it's a pretty uncomfortable situation. There are a lot of laws. There's tremendously high taxation. At certain points in time, learning Torah, doing mitzvahs are made outlawed, made legal, right? So there's a series of not great Roman leaders who were put in charge of the land of Israel. Most often they were based in Syria and Damascus, and really they're not interested in the Jews as a people. What they're interested in is taxation and power. Okay, in about 65 Common Era, a thing called the Great Revolt. The Great Revolt was essentially the Jewish people in Israel rejecting Roman rule and trying to throw them out. It actually went pretty well. The Jews did throw Rome out of a lot of the parts of Israel, particularly the north and the Galil. The problem is that the Roman Emperor Nero then sent a massive army to reconquer the land of Israel from the Jewish people. 4 years of fighting, and that gets us to the destruction of the Second Temple. Yeah, when the Romans come back, they're not interested in the Jews having political autonomy of any kind anymore, because that didn't work very well. They ended up rebelling. So the Romans come in, they level the place, they destroy the temple, they exile probably 1 million Jews at least into the Roman Empire. Several 100,000 Jews are killed. Yeah, and that's pretty much the end of Jewish autonomy in the land of Israel. Again, not that we had real autonomy, we had some level of autonomy. And again, as bad as the Romans were, even within the Jewish people, there were factions that were fighting with each other. Yeah, there was a big discussion, a big disagreement as to how to deal with Romans. Do we negotiate? Do we roll over and play dead? Do we go out and fight? Right? And as most often the case, the Jews were our own worst enemies. Yeah, there, for example, when the Romans besieged Jerusalem, there were enough supplies in Jerusalem to last for 22 years. The problem is that one of the Jewish factions that wanted to go out and fight went and destroyed all of the supplies to force the hand of the other Jews to go out and fight. The Romans probably would have at least attempted to destroy any vestiges of Judaism at that point. The leader of the Jews at the time was a man by the name of Rabbi Jon Neumann, and he essentially cut a deal with the General Vespasian, soon to be the Emperor Vespasian. And he essentially made a deal that the Romans would allow the Jewish leadership, the Jewish High Court, the Sanhedrin, to leave Jerusalem, go into exile, and relocate elsewhere. And also that the Romans would allow the descendants of King David to leave and to live. Right? Which is important because in terms of the future, yeah, we wanted to have a descendant of King David because King David is the line through which all future kings will come from. Okay, so Vespasian leaves, his son Titus continues the battle against the Jews and essentially destroys the land of Israel completely. Israel is then a complete vassal state of the Roman Empire. Okay.
Why did the Roman Empire want Israel? Is it just because they had this go forth and conquer all lands mentality, or was there something
Yes.
about it that they particularly identified?
The Roman Empire wanted Israel because it was there, because it was wealthy. And Israel is a great land bridge between the three great continents, between Europe, Asia, and Africa. So everybody had to pass through Israel, which means if you want to set up a tax booth, that's where you do it. Israel was tremendously wealthy relative to many other parts of the world. They wanted the tax revenue. They wanted it because it was there. And once Israel started rebelling, then that really rubbed the Romans the wrong way. How dare you? Don't you know who we are? We're the Romans. Everybody else fell into line. Who do you think you are? Yeah, the Jews were consistently a thorn in the side of first the Greeks and then the Romans. Let's keep going. Okay, so the Second Temple's been destroyed, and we've been exiled out of the land of Israel. There are still Jews living in the land of Israel, but the majority of the Jewish people have either gone into the Roman Empire, which is basically Europe, or fled east into Babylon, because there was still a Jewish community there. Because not all the Jews came back for the Second Temple period. So there's an established Jewish community in Babylon, so some of the Jews went east to go there as well. Okay. Things in the land of Israel continue to go from bad to worse. Okay, at this point, talking about 123 Common Era, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, continues to make decrees against the Jewish people about not practicing Jewish religious practices. There's another uprising, this time led by a man by the name of Bar Kokhba, which is actually successful and again manages to push the Romans out of the land of Israel for a period of time. Unfortunately, it doesn't last. After 3 years, the Romans come back with a bigger army. That's what the Romans do. And they destroy the last real formalized, established community in Israel at the time. Okay, the last holdout for the Bar Kokhba people was a city called Beitar, which is one of the things we talk about on Tisha B'Av because it was a massacre when the Romans came back in. All right. At this point in Jewish history, the leaders of the Jewish people, the rabbinical leaders of the Jewish people, look around and they say, whereas in the past, the Jewish nation was largely centralized in the land of Israel. They say that is no longer the case going forward. We can see there are Jews in Europe. There's the Jews in North Africa. There are Jews in the land of Israel. There are Jews in Babylon. right? The Jewish nation is now spreading out. And as we went to live in other countries, so you can imagine the level of anti-Semitism was only greater and greater and greater. Right? One thing when you're in your own country, but it's even more difficult to be a Jew when you're in someone else's country. So,
and now more people know of Jews because we're more spread out than we were before. So there's more opportunities for anti-Semitism from different groups, right?
and more assimilation as well.
Yeah.
And you know, again, in the pre-internet age, communication becomes a big issue.
Yeah.
Right? So Jewish people always had a centralized leadership. You had a Jewish high court. You had the greatest rabbis of the generation. Right? You had a king back when we had a king. Once everything gets spread out, so you have now discrete, 50 Jews here, 100 Jews here, 1,000 Jews here. But Jewish communities are they were never designed to be like independent like that. They're not just standalone things. Right? We're all part of the one big community. We need each other. Okay? We pray together, we work together, we trade together, we learn Torah together. Okay? So the rabbinical leaders who were still in Israel at this point, led by a man by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, or Judah the Prince, so realized that whereas up until this point, we didn't have a lot of texts, a lot of Jewish texts. What we had was an oral Torah, an oral learning that was taught from rabbi to students. That worked really well as long as we were geographically centralized. Once things started spreading out, they realized that they needed to now formalize a lot of those Jewish texts. Okay, the first one was formalized what we call the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the written down version of the oral law that was received on Mount Sinai. Okay, about 300 years later, skip that, we get to the Talmud, which is also another formalized version of the oral law given to Moses at Mount Sinai.
So, John, between 200 CE and 500 CE, 300 years, things are just going along nicely. Generations are
Again, things are
procreating
continuing
and
to spread out.
okay.
The only difference is that whereas in 200, the main rabbis were mostly still in the land of Israel, by 500, most of them moved to Babylon. Again, Babylon was an established community. It had been there since between the first and the second temple, which is 600 years ago at this point. And so the rabbis felt Babylon was a more stable place than the Roman Empire was. Okay? So there were two great yeshivas, two great houses of Jewish learning in Babylon, Sura and Pumbedisa, Tigris and Euphrates, if you know your modern day Iran, Iraq, right? That's where all this was going on. So whereas the Mishnah was basically written and edited in the land of Israel, because that's where the majority of the Jewish leadership was, by the time the Talmud comes around 300 years later, it's now mostly in Babylon. And the Talmud that we have today was written and edited and compiled in Babylon, because that's where Jewish scholarship had moved to.
So, John, you said earlier the first time that the Jews moved to Babylon,
Yes,
Israel
between the two temples. Yeah,
Israel was taken over by the Babylonians.
right.
So then comes the Greeks, then comes the Romans.
Yes,
But Babylon itself isn't completely destroyed by one of those two. It still exists in a smaller.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The Romans and the Greeks conquered parts of Babylon, but there was still a core of Babylon there.
So the Jerusalem Talmud was later or earlier?
Jerusalem Talmud was between the Mishnah and this would be the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was in the middle, again, right when the Jews were still mostly in the land of Israel. Because the situation in Israel was much more politically chaotic than in Babylon, that's why we consider the Babylonian Talmud to be more definitive because it was put together in a situation that was less chaotic. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Essentially, for 500 years between about the year 500 and year 1000 Common Era, things in Babylon were pretty good. Yeah? There was chaos in Europe. We're now in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages in Europe, but in Babylon things were pretty good. And the difference is that is that, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here, but the difference is that in Europe, you'd had the Roman Empire that then collapsed, and the whole continent went into anarchy for 1,000 years. Whereas in Babylon, things just kind of were rocking along at their own pace. You didn't have the same level of political upheaval and turmoil. It is really not until about the 10th century, 900,000 Common Era, that Jews start leaving Babylon and moving more into Europe.
And why did they do that? If they were happy with things.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about it, but essentially, as Islam grew, it spread from the Middle East into across North Africa, up into Spain, also up into Turkey, yeah, and the Jews went with everyone else. That's like the way the river was flowing.
Okay.
But the truth is that there were always Jews that stayed in places like Babylon, right? Most Sephardi Jews have lived in the same place since, possibly since the end of the Second Temple period. Yeah, I don't know what Korean Islam is like, but there are Jews who can trace their heritage back to 1,000 years in Babel, in North Africa, in Morocco, in Libya, in these sorts of places, because those communities were very, very stable. Yeah. Let's take a bit of a detour here and talk about Christianity. Christianity has had a big impact on the Jewish people. So going back to the year zero, let's say Jesus existed. Okay, so Jesus comes along and it's in the middle of the Roman occupation of the land of Israel. Okay, so the Second Temple is still standing, and what tends to happen in Jewish communities is when the situation gets particularly difficult, there is a sort of a messianic flavor that goes out. Right? Jews get very excited. Well, things are so bad. Maybe this means that the Messiah is about to come, Mashiach is about to come. Maybe this is the end of days. And during the Roman period of controlling the land of Israel, that was in the air. There was a very messianic kind of thing going on. So when Jesus came along with his sort of messianic ideas, the Romans were having nothing of it. The Romans were like, nah, we know what this is. Yeah, this is how a revolution, a revolt begins. So they shut down Jesus basically as fast as they could. Yeah. The thing is, though, there were his disciples, his students, and in future generations there were Saul and other people who picked up his teaching, picked up his ideas, and ran with them. And that was really the origin of Christianity. Christianity was very unsuccessful at converting Jews, but in terms of pagans, it was an upgrade. Christianity was very successful at proselytizing to pagans, to non-Jews.
That's what they're quite similar, actually. A lot of the ceremonies and stuff.
That's where they had the big wins. Essentially, the Romans initially had no interest in Christianity, other than feeding them to the lions. Again, they were very against Christianity. It wasn't until 312, when the Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity and makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So now, instead of being the other guys, they are the guys. And now there is tremendous violence being perpetrated against the Jews in the name of Christianity, because why won't you guys just convert? Why won't you just become Christians? And now you've got the strength of the Roman Empire behind the Christians. Okay. So in 476, the Roman Empire collapses. And this really plunges Europe into the Middle Ages, into the Dark Ages, because the Roman Empire had been the great unifying force and the great organizing force. The Romans were very, very good at making things like the roads work, making it safe for travel and for trade, having a fixed money supply, right? Collecting taxes, sending out units, army units, legions, and things to put down any insurrections around the place. Right? The Romans were into things being organized. When the Roman Empire falls apart, so Europe falls back into chaos. Because the Romans weren't defeated by another empire that took over. The Roman Empire imploded. Right? There was no "we're the new Romans in town." There was just nothing. There was a vacuum.
Is that the room only?
Yeah.
Wow. Just
But what happened was the church saw an opportunity. And in 800, in 800, Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, German tribes, becomes the new king. And what the church does is they legitimate him. They say that you are the king by right of divine rule. Right? Now, if you're a king, instead of just being the king by right of the fact that you won the battle, you're the biggest, to say, I not only have those things, I'm also the king by right of divine rule. Right? The church said, we stamp you as you are God's chosen king. So the church saw an opening that they would, throughout Europe, they could give a rubber stamp to kings, which gave them tremendous political power from that point on. They had the power of making and removing kings. Okay? They were also, remember that the Christian church was also selling entrance to heaven or escape from hell. Right? So the church really understood, it's kind of brilliant. Right? Understood, they found a way to make themselves not only relevant, to make themselves powerful. So the church effectively became the most powerful and influential organization in Europe because they went across all of the different countries. And the church was extremely anti-Semitic. Part of the church doctrine was that Jews would kill Christ and that Jews, by not converting to Christianity, were evil, needed to be destroyed. So as the church's political power grew, so did the anti-Semitism against the Jews throughout Europe. Because the church had very little influence in the Middle East and North Africa, because those were Muslim countries, as we'll talk about soon. So there was much less anti-Semitism in those countries, because you didn't have the church fostering
There was no
that.
doctrine at the time. There was no doctrine to tell them otherwise. They're just
Correct.
like, well, these are different, and we're living together.
If anything, we were fellow monotheists. Okay, so in 800, Charlemagne is anointed king with the stamp of the church. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Middle Ages anti-Semitism, because unfortunately it was a theme that continues until today. And again, the church was very, very comfortable with anti-Semitism because it suited their political agenda that the Jews killed Christ and the Jews were evil. Okay, for example, the Crusades. 1095, Pope Urban calls for a crusade of Christians to go to Jerusalem and free the Holy Land from the evil Muslim infidels. Okay, he basically promises the world to come, heaven, to anybody, any good Christian who would go and take on this journey, take on this job. The word crusade actually means to take the cross, because you were taking it from Europe into the Holy Land to the Muslim infidels, where you were going to serve justice. The problem is, of course, that if you're walking across Europe, it's a long way till you get to the Middle East, and there are a lot of Jewish communities that were much, much closer to where you started from. So every time the Crusades came across a Jewish community, they put two and two together, and they said, well, if we're going to get to heaven by going and killing Muslims in the Holy Land, Yeah? Surely that's even better if we kill Jews in our own homeland. So as the Crusades moved across Europe, they essentially destroyed every community, every Jewish community they came in contact with. You know, 10,000, at least 10,000 Jews died in Central Europe as the Crusaders moved across. And you know, the other benefit, of course, was when you killed a Jew, you got to take his stuff as well. So that was also kind of bonus.
Here? Wow.
What's that?
So how are we still here?
And that's part of the miracle Jewish history, by the way, is yes. Yeah. There were 3 crusades in total, another 1142, 1189, and again, more of the same thing, the destruction of Jewish communities across Europe.
If there were 3 crusades, did the crusaders not make it to Jerusalem to fulfill their mission? Or is it just waves of the same thing trying to accomplish?
So some of them did make it. There were periods of time where they did wrestle political control from the Muslims back into Christian hands, but things moved backwards and forwards. They weren't successful overall in the mission of reclaiming Israel to be a Christian country.
Yeah.
Historians generally agree that there were a couple of motivations for the Crusades. One of them was what we call in the Hebrew lishma, which is the, how do you translate lishma?
Earnest or sincere.
The most sincere motivation, which was a religious desire to free the Holy Land from the infidels. And a less sincere motivation would have been to get the riffraff out of Europe. Yeah?
Yeah.
Like it was a great way to, you know, everybody go over there, it's really good.
Yeah.
Right? Those who are left behind have really good life. And you could also say that it was always intended to be a way of an organized pogrom against the Jews, really, in Europe. That was always going to be part of what happened.
So, but essentially, it was against Muslims. That's how it started.
The theory was, but in practice, the Muslims were a long, long way away, and the Jews were much closer. So, if we're killing infidels, why don't we start with the closest ones first? Also, the Muslims had like swords and horses and stuff. The Jews not so much. The Muslims had an army. The Jews not so much.
Much greater numbers than the Jews.
Yeah. Okay. Another example of Middle Ages anti-Semitism, blood libels. Okay, 1144 in Norwich, in England. A Christian boy is found missing with stab wounds. Doesn't make sense. He's not found missing. He went missing. When they find his body, he has multiple stab wounds. Somebody came up with a good idea that the Jews had killed him, and they used his blood to make matzahs on Pesach. And any excuse to kill a Jew is a good excuse. And so this was another example of pogroms that were kicked off. And again, things develop a life of their own. This became a recurring theme. Every time someone died in suspicious circumstances, that must have been the Jews. In 1215, there was another blood libel that came about when the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which was the Christian leadership, got together, and they came up with the idea of the blood and the wafer, the wine and the wafer. Yeah. So the idea was that the wafer, and they used this in the Mass service, the wafer is the body of Christ and the wine is the blood of Christ. So Jews were accused of stabbing the wafers, which then led to more pogroms, because why not? Yeah, kill a Jew. Okay, another example, when the Black Death, the bubonic plague came through Europe in 1348, killed probably a third of Europe. Decimated the country. In Paris, there was something like 50,000 people who died. It was like half of the city. Like half the city of Paris died in a very short period of time. Rumors started the Jews had poisoned the wells, so of course any reason is a good reason to go out and kill Jews, and that's what happens. Probably the most horrific example of Middle Ages anti-Semitism, the Khmelnytsky massacres. So a little bit of background. Okay, so there were lots of Jews in Poland at this point, what we call Poland now. Next to Poland is Ukraine. There weren't many Jews in Ukraine. Poland invaded and took over Ukraine. Ukraine has a lot of farmland, and the Polish nobility didn't really want to be farmers, but they wanted to own the land. So they mostly put Jews into Ukraine to run the Ukrainian farms. The Ukrainian farmers who were there didn't like this very much at all, and as a result, in 1648, there was a Cossack warrior by the name of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who essentially organized other Cossacks, other Ukrainians, into a fighting force and went and killed many, many, many Jews. Probably at least 100,000 Jews in particularly brutal ways. Yeah, they started in Ukraine and then went back into Poland to kill Jews there as well. It is very interesting that in Ukraine, Khmelnytsky is still considered to be somewhat of a hero. There are statues of him around the place. He's on the money. He's seen as a liberator of Ukraine, as opposed to a massacre of Jews, which is what he was. Okay, so the Middle Ages were not a great time for Jews in Europe. It was kind of a case of, well, now what? Yeah, you spin that big wheel to see which anti-Semitism is going to come up next. Okay, let's jump to and talk about Islam. I'll take a little bit of a step back. Okay, so Muhammad's born in 570 Common Era. He's a merchant from Medina, and as a young man, he visits Israel and he encounters Christians and Jews there, and he kind of likes what he hears. He likes the ideas from the Bible. And he decides that he is the most recent and the final prophet of God.
He decides that.
Yes.
So is that a revelation, or he just
Yes.
one afternoon he just has some tea and
He
something?
goes to the desert and comes back and says, "Good news, guys, I had a vision from God."
Right, okay.
It could be he felt they're going to have an epileptic fit, and that was pretty convincing as well.
Sure.
But he essentially comes back and says, "Here's the deal, guys. I'm the latest, greatest." And some of the details that the Jews and the Christians wrote down were a little bit wrong. Yeah. God did not, in fact, tell Abraham to take his son Isaac and sacrifice him. God told Abraham to take his son Ishmael and sacrifice him, for example. Yeah. As a colonizing force, the Muslim people were tremendously effective. Within about 20 years of it starting, they basically spread across the entire, from Morocco in the west to Iran and Iraq in the east, from Turkey in the north, down into Africa in the south.
So,
Yeah.
how was he able to do that? Why would people follow? People were
Yeah.
Jews and Christians
Yeah.
and happy to do their own thing.
So
Why would they go?
right. So he wasn't into the sort of philosophical approach to proselytizing. He was more into the put a sword at the person's neck and say convert or die, which is quite an effective strategy.
Democracy wasn't his
No. No, and again, it wasn't on the basis of the strength of his argument. It was on the basis of the strength of his army that he converted large groups of people to
And
Islam.
that was attractive to people? That
Yes.
kind of
Living is quite attractive to people, yes. People are into that.
people that to fight.
Yeah. Not the Jews, but certainly a lot of the nomadic tribes who are in this part of the world who were like, okay, sure, no worries. Just don't kill me, please.
Shame.
There's
You have to
more
know your audience.
damage than that, actually. Just wait until you hear the rest.
Okay, one of the groups of Muslims were called the Moors. The Moors were in North Africa, I think Morocco, I think what is now Fez today, Casablanca, if you know that part of the world. So, who? Okay. The Moors are actually fairly chilled and relaxed as far as Muslim subgroups went. So, with the success of conquering Northern Africa, the Moors took Islam and moved up into Spain, right, through Gibraltar up into Spain, crossing into Europe. Okay, and they were successful. They actually conquered Spain in 711, and with them went Jews. Jews that had been in the Middle East and North Africa spread out as Islam spread, including spreading up into Spain. Okay, now you had Jews in Europe already, but those are Jews that have been there since the time of the Roman Empire, right? So Jews had originally gone up through Turkey and across the land bridge, from east to west, and now they're going across Northern Africa up into Spain and from west to east. Okay? The problem was of course that you had large parts of the Middle East and Europe that were controlled by the Muslims, and large parts of Europe that were controlled by Christians. And those two nations were at war. You didn't have communication between those two groups. So the Jews in the Muslim world are what we call Sephardim, and the Jews in the Christian European world are what we call Ashkenazim. And they essentially developed separately for hundreds of years, because if you lived in the Christian world, you couldn't just go on holidays to a Muslim country, right? It didn't work like that. So the two communities were largely cut off from each other, right? You had different rabbis in the Sephardi and Ashkenazi world, and so you had different customs developing over time and so on. And for a period of about 4, 5, 6, 700 years, you didn't have a lot of communication between the Jews in the Muslim world, the Sephardim, and the Jews in the Christian world, the Ashkenazim. All right, let's get into some stuff. Okay, so when the Moors pushed up into Spain, the Jews went with them. Things were pretty good. There's what we call the Golden Age of Spain, about 300 years. And so the Moors were fairly chilled. They were into culture, they were into commerce, they were into finance, and the Jews were also into those sorts of things. Things were good in Spain. The finance minister of Spain was a Jew. Yeah, Don Isaac Abarbanel. Things were fairly good during Spain in Spain during those times. The problem is the Christians pushed back down into Spain from the north and from the east, and they pushed the Muslims out. Okay, the Jews were left there. So the Jews who had come up through North Africa in the Muslim countries were now under control of a Christian king and a Christian queen. So what happened was that the Christians, again, who were very into converting people into Christians, put a lot of pressure on the Jews to either convert or die, which is not a great choice. This is where you have Jews who pretended to convert, right? We call them Moranos, because the way to get ahead in Christian society was to pretend to be Christian, even if you didn't really mean it. Okay? The problem is that the Christians caught on that this was going on. Jews were pretending to be Christians. So you had a thing called the Inquisition. Right? The purpose of the Inquisition was to work out which Jews who had converted to Christians were really Christians and which ones were just Jews pretending to be Christians. So you had a thing called auto de fe. An auto de fe was a test of a person's faith. So if you had a Jew who was suspected of being a pretend Christian, not a real Christian, so you would torture them if they confessed to really being Jewish and only pretending to be Christian. So you would kill them and burn their body at the stake. If they didn't confess to being Jewish, so you would not kill them and then you burn them at the stake. Right? So either way, the ultimate damned if you do, damned if you don't option there.
From the history of the world. Spanish
Inquisition, here we
Harder to do what's
Inquisition.
allowed, whatever. It's very hard to do what you do
They still actually do that.
Very good.
It's just
anyway.
set them in a little bit lowbrow.
So how did the Jews that have come into Spain
Yes.
not get converted
Some of
to
them
being
did.
Muslim?
Oh, to be Muslim.
Yeah.
The Muslims didn't require you to convert and become a Muslim. Because,
Because you were saying they
yeah.
had swords at people's necks.
Yes.
like,
So
convert
if
or
you
die.
were a pagan or of no religion, then you got the sword to the neck to become a Muslim.
Yeah.
If you're a monotheist, a Christian or a Jew,
Yeah.
Christianity, let's call it monotheism for sake of argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Islam teaches that there is a separate set of laws for a Jew or a Christian. You don't have to convert them, They're what's called dhimmi, which is like a special people. So they get taxed, they have low rights, they're treated like garbage, but you don't have to convert them. So in the Islam world, in the Muslim world, you're allowed to stay a Jew as long as you pay, your taxes and everything else. Whereas in the Christian world, Jews were a thorn in the side of Christians. And so it was convert or die. Yeah. Okay, so for 12 years, the Inquisition goes on, and then at some point, essentially the Moors have been kicked out of Spain. The Christian governments, the king and the queen in Spain, no longer need the Jews. They don't need their money, they don't need their influence. And so there is the expulsion. Yeah, 1492, the Jews are given 8 months to prepare. They will be thrown out of Spain. Happens on Tisha B'Av, that's another topic. Probably 150,000 Jews left Spain on the day. Many had left before, obviously. There's no mitzvah to wait till the last minute. Leave early, be prepared. 100,000 went into Portugal, right, over the border. 5 years later, got thrown out of there as well. A lot went back to Israel. Those who could afford to get on a boat went back to Israel, and others spread out throughout the rest of Europe. But really, one of the recurring themes in Europe in the entire Middle Ages was this idea of expulsion. Yeah, Jews being thrown out of different countries.
Country that they
Yeah.
lived in.
Thrown out of England in 1290, France in 1306 and 1394, Hungary in 1349 and 1360, Austria in 1421, Germany multiple times throughout the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, Lithuania 1445, 1495, Spain 1492, obviously Portugal 1497. It's like ping pong. Yeah. Jews were considered property, and the king could invite you in, and the king could throw you out, depending on what his whims were on any given
How do
day.
you become everyone else's chattel?
So when we get to the French Revolution coming up shortly, it will become clear how that worked. Okay, it's very interesting. Again, when you look at the arc of Jewish history, it's fascinating because everyone else, every other nation in the world, when you move to a new country, you assimilate. And after 2 or 3 generations, you are whatever everyone else is. The Jews always stayed as an independent nation. Right? It's not a normal phenomenon. We take it for granted that we are Jews who live in Australia, or Jews who live in England, or Jews who live in America. When I was a kid in the 80s, right, there were lots of Greeks and Italians who had come out from Europe in the 50s and 60s as well. Right? So the kids and the grandkids were in school with me and stuff like that. So those people don't think of themselves as Greeks and Italians. They're Australians. Yeah, their great-grandparents came from Greece and Italy, but they think of themselves as Australians. That's what assimilation means. It's the craziest thing that we are Jews who haven't lived in Israel for 2,000 years, and we're still walking around going, I'm a Jew. I live in Australia, but I'm not Australian. Yeah? It's not normal things like that. So the reason why the Jews were the ones getting kicked out of those countries in Europe was because we were the ones who were acting like we didn't belong. Everybody else assimilated. They became like the locals. Right? So after 2 generations, you couldn't tell who was a newcomer, who was an oldcomer. But the Jews were like, proudly, no, just visiting. Very easy to kick out. Let's talk about how things worked in Europe in the Middle Ages. Okay.
Not very. No grades.
Not great for the Jews. Okay. For a lot of Jewish history, Jews were traders. And the reason why we were traders was because we weren't allowed to own land. We weren't allowed to be professionals. We certainly weren't allowed to be nobility or anything like that. We often weren't allowed to join the army because we were considered not trustworthy. So what advantage did Jews have? Well, every Jew had a cousin over here and a cousin over there and a brother-in-law over there. Right? Jews were great traders. We had language in common. and we had families spread out throughout the diaspora.
When you say language in common, were we speaking Hebrew to some degree?
So even though Jews spoke whatever the language of the country they lived in,
Yeah.
a lot of them also spoke Hebrew, which meant you had a language in common with people on the other side of Europe.
Yeah.
Right? I speak French, he spoke Hungarian. That we didn't have in common, but we could both speak enough Hebrew, and we trusted each other. Yeah, which if you're going to go into trade is really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
Is it Hebrew or Yiddish you're talking about?
Well, this is pre-Yiddish.
Yeah, not
In the last,
Well, that
200 years, you might
predates,
say Yiddish, but yeah, we're talking a long time before Yiddish. Okay. And by the way, this worked great when the Romans were in control, because again, the Romans had the roads worked out, and the trade worked out, and the ports were good, and the trains ran on time, and all that sort of stuff. Great for trade. Okay. After the Roman Empire fell apart, so Europe basically descended into what's called the feudal system. The feudal system was people who owned a little bit of land would work their own land. Right? We call them peasants or serfs. And what happened was they were tremendously susceptible to being attacked by other people. So a bunch of serfs got together and they went to some noble person and said, "Will you protect us?" The noble person said, "Of course I'll protect you. You give me your land, you can keep working it. Right? I'll own the land and I will protect you." Right? That's called indentured servitude. And essentially Europe was made up of mostly peasants and serfs who worked the land, being ruled over by lords, being ruled over by a knight, being ruled over by someone who reported to the king with the king on top. Okay? Very, very hierarchical society. The Jews were not part of that structure. We weren't allowed to own land. We weren't trusted to work land. We certainly weren't allowed to be lords or knights or kings or anything like that. We were kind of outside the system. So other than trade, there wasn't a lot that the Jew could do. Then in 1179, the Third Lateran Council, again, Christians getting together and making up laws, decided that Christians could no longer lend money to each other with interest. Okay? So that created an opportunity for Jews to be money lenders, because Christians couldn't lend money, but they wanted to lend money. So what do? You get a Jew to lend money on your behalf. So the capital was coming from Christians because they had the wealth. They would give it to a Jew and say, "Go out and lend it to my friend." Yeah, lend it at 40% interest rates. I'll take 30% and you can keep 10%. Okay. The problem is that when the guy who took out the loan reneged on the loan and decided he didn't want to repay, he didn't go to the Christian who was taking the 30%. He went to the Jew who was taking the 10%. Yeah, it was not a good business to be in, because if you didn't like the terms, if you didn't want to repay the loan, so giving the Jew a hard time wasn't a problem. You could confiscate his property, you could kill him, you could. Yeah, so the Jews were the money lenders of Europe, which sounds great, but it really wasn't. Okay, so that's money lending. The other thing that happened in the 1500s, the idea of a ghetto became a thing. Originally, what Christians would do is when they'd had enough of the Jews, they would expel them, they would throw them out of their country. Then in Venice, they came up with the idea of a ghetto. A ghetto meant that you could make all the Jews live in one place, usually the worst part of town, and you could lock them in at night. You build a wall around them, and you lock them in at night. During the day, you let them out, they could do their business, and at night, you lock them in there. And that way, you had the benefit of having Jews in your community, but they weren't like out and about, like getting up to mischief.
What are they going to do? What are they going to do at night time?
What are they going to
They're
do?
not bats, or rather just
Knock
like
on
those
people's
sucking
front
blood.
doors and run away.
But
No, I'm just saying,
Remember-
like, if you're allowed, if I'm the very, very dangerous person,
yes.
I shouldn't be allowed in the morning, because at night time I'll be actually sleeping. So I think I'll be less manners if you believe
Right.
that.
But the truth is, even during the day when they were allowed out, they still all lived in the ghetto. You needed a reason to leave. Right? You couldn't just come and go as you please. It was a way of controlling Jewish communities
Right, okay.
by forcing them to live in a certain place and then controlling their comings and their goings. And it wasn't the best part of town. Usually it was like the bad part of town. Okay, let's talk about scholarship. What's interesting is, though, during the Middle Ages, Jewish scholarship flourished. If you're locked in your community at night, right, all you can do is stay home and learn Torah.
But you're not really allowed to do anything else
Exactly.
anyway, so.
Exactly. So there was actually a wellspring of Jewish learning and Jewish scholarship that sprang up during the Middle Ages period.
I think that's brilliant because I'll be actually in the fetal position crying the whole night.
John and Andrew would have loved with me in that time.
Rashi, for example, was born in
Living
1040 in Troyes in France.
It's like
Lived through the
lockdown.
Crusades. Rashi is the great commentator of Jewish texts. You'd be hard pressed to find a Torah, 5 books of Moses, that doesn't have Rashi's commentary. You wouldn't find a version of the Talmud that doesn't have Rashi's commentary. Yeah, Rashi is considered one of the most fundamental commentators on Torah sources. And Maimonides, also during the Middle Ages, 1135, Common Era, he was born in Cordova in Spain. There's a nice statue of him there, you can go visit it. He was thrown out of Spain, went to Morocco, then finally came to Israel and ended up in Egypt, where he spent most of his time. He was a great codifier of Jewish law. He gathered together many areas of Jewish law into one single text, 14 volumes, Yad Chazaka, the Mishnah Torah, and that was his great contribution to Jewish learning. He was also very into philosophy and things like that. He wrote basically a response to Aristotle, explaining how the Jewish version differed from the Greek version. He was also a doctor. He was the personal physician of the Saladin. There is a story that's possibly not true, but could be, that when Richard the Lionheart III came with the Crusades to conquer the Holy Land, he got sick and he wanted a Jewish doctor. So the Rambam, who was already the doctor of the Sultan, the Saladin, also became the doctor of the Christian leader as well. You know, like Christians and Muslims, they want a Jewish doctor. That's just like the way the world works.
Nothing's changed.
Exactly.
Nothing's changed. I was about to say that. I said, oh, they're still going to Jewish doctors.
Okay, third person dimensions, Rabbi Joseph Caro. Rabbi Joseph Caro began in Spain also left Spain, moved to Sfat in northern Israel, where he spent most of his life. Was responsible for compiling a book called the Shulchan Aruch, which is essentially the definitive guide to Jewish law in all areas of life. Yeah, 500 years later, we still refer to that book. It's still authoritative.
Who would have thought that congestion produced so many brilliant brains?
Yeah. One thing about Jews is that they will find a way to flourish in the most difficult of circumstances. And again, we think it's normal. It's not normal because it doesn't happen to other nations. Other nations are assimilated or conquered out of existence. The Jews just find a way to continue to go on with our national mission, and somehow we find a way to thrive despite the adversity.
Does any of that have to do with like literacy? A lot of the world was illiterate.
Yeah.
But the fact
Yeah.
that
Sure. All those things we talked about before.
Yeah.
You know, and again, this theme continues. The Holocaust is the best example of that. The Holocaust, not best example, it's a good example in our recent history. The Holocaust should have been the end of the Jews, yet somehow post-Holocaust, look at Jewish life in America. Flourishing. Yeah? Look at Jewish life in Israel. It shouldn't be like that. It should be that when something like a Holocaust happens to a group of people, that's the end of them. It's a reoccurring theme. You know, we're now 2,500 years after the destruction of both of our temples, right? Both of those should be the end of the Jewish people. There's something not normal about Jewish history. And when you look at the arc, when you look at the big picture, right? Like, it's just a reoccurring theme of we shouldn't be here. We shouldn't have the influence that we have. We should still be changing the world. There shouldn't still be a conversation about, like, you know, today's news is all about the Jews. It shouldn't be that way. You know, 3,000 years later, it's still all about the Jews. What's up with that?
I suppose we're very interesting.
We are interesting. That's one way to put it. It's one way to put it.
No, I'm just like, I can't well go to a non-Jewish person and say, what do you think about us? It's just...
Okay, we're getting to the end. We've got 2 more phases to do here. I split it up here into Eastern Europe and Western Europe because things were kind of different. Okay, we are now the very end of the Middle Ages, right? 1700 to 1880. Okay. The main event that's happening here is the decline of the church. The church that had been growing in power from about the year 500 to about the year 1500 now starts to decline. There's a bunch of reasons why that happens. Essentially, all of those European kings that had been put in place and stamped by the church all of a sudden realized, you know what? We don't need the church. We can do it ourselves.
branched out.
Okay, you have things like the Black Plague, right, undermining authority of the church. Well, if good Christians are dying along with everybody else, so what does that mean? The church couldn't protect anybody from the bubonic plague. You have things like Martin Luther and the Reformation in 1517, undermining the power of the church and highlighting the corruption within the church. People going, hang on a sec. You have the invention of the printing press, which made it easy to disseminate things like this. And finally, you have the French Revolution in 1789. So the French Revolution was really the spark that kicked off what became the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was when Western Europe, so France, Germany, that side of the continent, became much more focused on humanity, the power of humans, as opposed to not religion, not Christianity, not God. Right? We don't need any of that stuff. Right? The encyclopedia was invented, science exploded, the Industrial Revolution. Right? All these things are about removing the influence of God and religion from people's lives. So the French Revolution was really a continuation of this, because the French kings ruled by divine right, and people said, no, 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 we're not interested in that anymore. Right? They overthrew the monarchy, and in the vacuum that existed after the French Revolution, so 1789, so Napoleon Bonaparte came into power. Napoleon Bonaparte was a very, very forward-thinking kind of guy, and is very taken with all of the ideas of the Enlightenment. He was into tolerance, right? He was into the idea of people having rights, which was an unheard of idea in up until this point in world history. Yeah. So as Napoleon conquered most of Europe and North Africa, he brought with him all of these ideas about human rights and tolerance, culture, right? All of the nationalism in Europe all has its origins in Napoleon going around and saying, "You are a group of people. We love you. You have your own identity and your own culture and your own religion. That's great. We embrace all of that." Right? That all came from there. So all of this weakened the influence of the church. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, so Napoleon's big thing, Napoleon's big thing with the Jews. Napoleon understood exactly what the problem with Jews were. The way Napoleon put it was, if an English person comes to visit France, we don't let him vote, because we say, you're not a French person, you're an English person, you're just visiting here. But when a Jew lives in France, is he a visitor or is he a citizen? And this wasn't a problem for any other group of people. So Napoleon was wrestling with this idea of, what is a Jew? Is a Jew a Frenchman who's Jewish, or is he a Jewish person who lives in France? Right? So Napoleon's conclusion was basically that it was okay to be a Jew and a Frenchman. You could still have all the other rights that other Frenchmen enjoyed. Right? So this led to the Edicts of Toleration, where countries throughout Europe would give Jews rights. Now they're allowed to own property. Now they're allowed to go to university. Now they're allowed to do all these things that for the last 1,000 years they hadn't been allowed to do. Now, this was good, kinda. The reason why it wasn't good was because there were three ways that Jews responded. The first way was conversion, assimilation. Jews said, wait, I can be a Christian now, and I get all the benefits? That's great. Or I can stay a Jew and get all the benefits. That's wonderful. So a lot of Jews threw off their Jewish identity, or their Jewishness, and they said, great, now that all the doors are open, I will walk through them. That was one response. A second response was reform. Okay, first Reformed temple was opened in 1818 in Germany, in Hamburg. Right, Reformed Judaism was an attempt to say, sure, we're Jewish, but we're not that Jewish. We're basically Germans who happen to be culturally Jewish. And therefore, let's remove all the references to God, all the references to Israel, all the references to Messiah, all of the things that other Germans would find kind of offensive because it's anti-German. Right? Reform was an attempt to dumb down Judaism to the point where you could be like everybody else and also be a little bit Jewish. And the truth is, you also have the Orthodox world as well. You had people who wanted to stay Jewish, but they still had to respond to the Enlightenment. So, for example, Chassam Sofer was a person who lived had a big yeshiva in Pressburg in Slovakia, and the Chassam Sofer response was that even though they've opened all the doors to Jews, we are going to lock ourselves away. This is the shtetl mentality. This is the Hasidic mentality. We'll talk about it in a minute. The idea of we don't want to join that world. We want to build our own walls, right? We're not going to have the internet. We're not going to have cell phones. We're not going to, well, that whole mentality really has its roots in the Chassam Sofer, the early 1800s, as a response to the Enlightenment. Rabbi Hirsch was a slightly different take on it. Again, in the Orthodox world, he was, no, we can embrace that world and we can still retain our Jewish identity. We can have both. Yeah? Really the philosophical origin of what we call modern Orthodoxy today. That was in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, things looked a little bit different. In Eastern Europe, the first response to the poverty and the lack of Torah scholarship in Eastern Europe was the Hasidic movement. Eliezer ben Israel, better known as the Baal Shem Tov, in 1730, came along and really came up with this idea of you don't have to be a person who is learned to be a Jew, right? You can be a poor, ignorant peasant, and you can join this thing called Hasidus, which is the focus then became on things like prayer, on things like joy, on things like singing, as opposed to Torah scholarship. Because in order to be a Torah scholar, you need to be sufficiently wealthy that you can spend time sitting and learning. If you're a poor Eastern European Jew, right, and you're struggling to survive, so you ain't got time to be sitting around learning Torah. So the idea was you get yourself a Rebbe. The Rebbe is the one who is the Torah scholar. And by connecting to him, yeah, so you get all of the benefits. And this idea caught on. And in much of Eastern Europe, you had every town had their Rebbe, and the Hasidim were the followers of that Rebbe, right? So you had, all of the kinds of Hasidim that we're familiar with were all towns in Eastern Europe. The Ger and the Vishnitz and the Satamar and the Lubavitch, right? These were all towns in Eastern Europe that had a Rebbe, and the followers were called Hasidim. Okay. Just a few more points, and then we're done for tonight. In the late 1700s, Russia expanded west, and a lot of parts of Russia that were Jewish became under Russian control. So the Tsars in Russia didn't really like the Jews, to put it bluntly, so they created a thing called the Pale of Settlement. The palace settlement, the idea was, again, to have an area that was specifically set aside for Jews. We know where they are. We know how to control them. Yeah, we can make sure they stay poor and impoverished. Right. So the palace settlement was an area in Western Russia, Eastern Poland, what we call Lithuania, Ukraine, Crimea, Bessarabia, all that sort of places where Jews were allowed to live in those places and not in other parts of Russia. The famous Cantonist decrees, where Jewish boys would have to go to the army for 25 years, which is effectively a death sentence. Again, lots of anti-Semitism directed towards the Jewish people. As the Enlightenment moved from Western Europe into Eastern movement, what's called the Haskalah, which is really the Eastern European version of the Enlightenment, also took on. You had a lot of Jews who tried to, again, to become modern in the sense that they removed all of the parts of Judaism that were holding them back in life. They removed all the God bits, all the Israel bits, all the Messiah bits, and they kept the cultural aspects of Judaism. So this is where you get, Fiddler on the Roof and stuff like that, the idea of being a Jew but not with any of the Jewish stuff, right? The idea of the Shalom Aleichem and Yiddish, right? Yiddish has its roots in here because it's a way of being Jewish culturally, but not being religious. Interestingly, also a thing called the Volozhin Yeshiva. Up until this point in Jewish history, we didn't really have formal schools for Jewish learning for adults. You had schools for kids, but you didn't have the idea of a place where men could go to learn Torah as adults, like a rabbinical training school. The Volozhin Yeshiva was really the first formal place you had it. Up until this point, if you wanted to learn Torah, so you learned it from your father, you had a one-on-one relationship with a Rebbe, you didn't have a formal school. 1803, Volozhin Yeshiva is formed in Lithuania, and this is really the progenitor of the modern yeshiva movement, the idea of having schools set aside dedicated for people to come and learn Torah. It lasted for about 100 years, for 89 years. Eventually the Russians insisted that they teach secular studies. The yeshiva decided to close down instead of comply with that because they felt that was completely undermining what they were trying to do. If we go back to our arc at the top here, we've now effectively reached the end here. And if you remember on the original picture, this is where it starts turning up. Okay? This is the third leg of our three-legged arc of Jewish history. Next week, we're going to pick up from about the late 1800s, and it's really going to talk about how we got from all of here to the modern state of Israel. Okay? Now, just take a second to appreciate. It's been 2,000 years since we last had a state of Israel. And even the Second Temple period was nothing compared to the First Temple period. So it's been more like 2,500 years. And we've taken a heck of a journey throughout all of Europe, all of Africa, right? We've been everywhere, man. And the next step is not, and that was the end of the Jewish people, right? It's been fun, guys. Last one out, turn off the lights. And now we're going to reinstitute the state of Israel. Torah is flourishing in America like it never has been before, in Europe also, and now we're going up. Okay, that's what I want to talk about next week. We will also talk about Palestinians and Arab-Israel conflicts and all that sort of stuff, because that's an important part of that story. But it's really like, now it gets good, right? Now it's all uphill from here. Okay? It's a jagged line, so there are down points, but on a trend, that's next week. Okay? That's the good stuff.
Okay, so